In the previous mini lecture, I introduced the theoretical tradition of queer theory. Although some queer theorists and activists argue that queer theory extends beyond a theoretical tradition that can be defined, many scholars and activists agree that queer theory is essentially a critical analysis of the social construction of human sexuality. Specifically, queer theory challenges the binary and essential notions of human sexuality. Queer theory also challenges various sexual categories and rather promotes a more fluid understanding of human sexuality. Today, we'll continue our discussion of queer theory, specifically looking at some broad queer concepts, as well as some key queer theorists and the implication of queer theory on the sociological study of human sexuality. Although some queer theorists have suggested that queer itself can have neither a fundamental logic nor consistent set of characteristics, there are a number of key concepts that apply to most variations of queer theory. In the previous mini lecture, we looked specifically at the three interrelated projects of queer theory. And here we'll explore some key concepts more broadly as they apply to queer theory and queer perspectives. Given that queer by definition is whatever's at odds with the normal, the legitimate, and the dominant, it's not surprising that one of the key concepts of queer theory is the challenging and questioning of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity, as we've mentioned in previous lectures, is the notion that heterosexuality is normal, natural, and desirable. And given that one of the interrelated projects of queer theory is challenging heterosexuality as the benchmark of sexuality in a society, queer theorists also challenge and explore heteronormativity, including how it came into being and why it is the dominant perspective in a society. Queer theorists also explore the difference between politics of identity and politics of difference. Specifically, queer theorists often shift from a politics of identity to a politics of difference. And this can be seen in the way in which early queer theorists critiqued the gay liberation movement of the 1970s. If you recall, early queer theorists argued that this was not a single universal movement. In fact, lesbians and other sexualities felt excluded from the movement, including trans folks and bisexual folks. Queer theorists also used the notion of performativity to illustrate how our expected gender performance creates false binaries related both to gender and sexuality. And queer theorists illustrated the politics of difference further by addressing the challenges faced by people of color that were not recognized by a larger gay liberation movement during the 1970s. Finally, queer theorists also focus on this notion of intersectionality, which we discussed in the last mini lecture. Intersectionality is a theoretical approach that considers multiple grounds of identity and the ways in which various modes of oppression intersect and work together in society. It was first introduced by legal scholar and feminist Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. There are a few queer theorists you should know. In the reading for this week, Queer, A Question of Being or A Question of Doing, Nikki Sullivan outlines multiple queer perspectives. But here we'll focus on three key theorists who have been especially important to the social construction of sexuality and to a sociological exploration of human sexuality. We'll begin with Michel Foucault, who is often seen as a scholar who bridges social constructionism and queer theory. Foucault, a post-structuralist, argued that sexuality is a discursive production rather than any kind of essential drive, and that sexuality is created by social institutions to control populations. Gail Rubin is another important queer theorist. Rubin argued that sexual identities and behaviors are organized in a hierarchy through a system of sexual classification. In other words, we classify sexuality so that we can put individuals into a stratified structure that allows some people to have opportunities and privileges and creates obstacles and limitations for others. Finally, and another important queer theorist is Judith Butler. Butler argued that gender and sexuality is acted out and portrayed in a performative reality. And this performance of gender and sexuality essentially reinforces the notion of a binary. Queer theory has played a significant role in the study of human sexuality, specifically in looking at sexual inequality, sexual oppression, and the ways in which our society normalizes some forms of sexuality over others. Queer theory undermines the base structure of identity politics that assumes similarity across category and argues that sexuality cannot be disconnected from other categories of social status and identity, creating unique experiences and oppressions for people. Queer theory questions how sexuality shapes and is shaped by other factors in a way very similar to the social constructionist approach. And queer theory illuminates the benefits of interdisciplinary scholarship, specifically thinking intersectionally when we look at human sexuality. As we move forward taking a sociological approach to the study of human sexuality this semester, I think it's important to consider how the benefits of queer theory can be applied to a sociological toolbox.